Afternoon to our Malaysian friends. This is Stefano. We are connected here for our webinar here in our course. And today we have the pleasure of having with us Pavel Luksha, who is going to lead us a little bit on the skills foresight topic. Pavel has also collaborated with the International Labour Organization to produce the ILO Foresight Guide, which stays within our organization, let's say, the main guidelines for this topic. I would like maybe to ask Pavel to briefly introduce himself, and then we can do a short roundtable in order to get also the presentations from the participants, while we are also waiting more participants to connect. Pavel, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today. And my name is Pavel Luksha. Currently, my main affiliation is Global Education Futures, which is an international think and action tank for the transformation of professional and higher education and basic education as well around the globe. And for the last over a decade, I work with skills anticipation topic. I find it quite exciting because I think that through this work we can see that how dramatic transformations in our society influence the transformation of job markets and what kind of skills we can expect to arise in the future. And right now we are undergoing through one of historically maybe most significant transformations in the economy and society. And this is what we are going to discuss today. And I look forward to share with you some of our results of our work, the practice we are using, and some, let's say, ways of applying it so that it can inform people in professional education, it can inform young people for career guidance, and different applications that you will see during the presentation today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pavel. I think it's quite exciting to see also, of course, the skills anticipation results as inputs for TVET and higher education policies. I would like maybe just very briefly for our Malaysian participants, if they can introduce themselves, as we are a little group right now and maybe more will come. So maybe we will start. Diana.
Hello, everyone. My name is Diana. I work with Talent Corporation Malaysia. I'm a research analyst, so I mainly work with labor market data and mainly on occupations, critical occupations, as well as right now we're starting to look into skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Layali? The microphone is hit. Okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
Hello. Good afternoon from here, Malaysia. I'm Layali from Department of Statistics, Malaysia. I'm currently attached with Malaysian Bureau of Labour Statistics. Mainly, we do analysis of labour force, labour supply and labour demand, and we are looking forward to learn more about how we can also do analysis of skill anticipation and skill job charting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Raja? Raja Khairul? I don't know if there is a problem with the microphone. Otherwise, Nizam, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm sorry, Nizam from Skill for Prosperity Program, ILO.
Thank you very much. Okay, so maybe we can slowly start when Raja can open the microphone and present. This will be also an opportunity to share. Pavel, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Stefano. So let me start. So I'm
in any
going
case,
to talk to
the webinar is recorded, so also for the participants who will not be able to follow it live, it will be interesting, of course, to follow it. Thank you, Pavel.
Yes, thank you. So what I'm going to present today is a method that was developed in collaboration with International Labour Organization about 10 years ago. And I will later mention its applications, but all in all, it was applied in over 20 countries around the globe for skills anticipation projects. And before going to describe the method, I would like to share with you what I think is the context of the situation, why we need this type of methodologies at all, and what are the dramatic changes that I already have mentioned in my introduction. So, first of all, I think we all can perceive the last 2 years as increasingly uncertain social reality, where a lot of things are changing, and sometimes it's not very clear where we want to evolve our work in terms of job market policies, in terms of working with professional education systems and so on. And it's a little bit like one of the metaphors I use is like building a bridge in the fog, because we have to implement these policies, but it's not very clear if there is the other end of the other bank of the river, and where are we building this bridge. So we need to find some clarity around it. And of course, the challenge of working with future is that many people think that future is very hard to predict, and that we probably do not have reliable methods of forecasting what to expect, because every time we can see that unpredictable or low probability events can disrupt many things in our social reality, in our markets. So indeed, this is a challenge that any forecasters, predictors, or foresighters are facing. But there are also methods to increase certainty, to create some, let's say, reliability that allows us to establish some, let's say, viable facts around what to expect in the future. And one of the approaches that is useful in this context is called Foresight. And I think in your webinars you have generally already discussed the approach of Foresight, but just to remind you, the idea of Foresight is that I used one metaphor that can describe this idea. So you may know this type of puzzle, the jigsaw puzzle, when we have a big picture but cut into little pieces. So when you pick up a little piece, it doesn't make any sense. So maybe there's like a part of a cloud, some object, like an eye, for example, but you cannot recognize the whole picture. But if you put many pieces together, the image begins to emerge. So if we imagine that people around us, people involved in certain sector, in certain national development, they have like little pieces of that image of the future, because they work with certain strategies, they work with certain approaches, they can perceive what is changing around them. So they hold like a little piece of that jigsaw puzzle. So by putting these pieces together, we can see how a picture is emerging. So this is what foresights do in a nutshell. And therefore, the idea of foresight is to bring many stakeholders that influence the situation into a conversation, and that allows to really see what lies ahead. So I will begin by sharing with you results of one foresight study, and I will later mention how the study was accomplished, because that was accomplished in one of the moments when we saw this dramatic change 2 years ago with COVID pandemics. And of course, a lot of people had a question whether job markets will continue to develop, whether we are going to see the major economic downturn and so on. And together with a global movement, World Skills International, we conducted a large study with over 50 countries and over 800 experts participating. And we saw some, let's say, image that I would like to see with you, share with you the image of the changing social reality, but really promising opportunities for new types of jobs and new types of, let's say, the development of our society. So we already can see that in the last decade and perhaps more, we witness the transformation of many fundamental institutions of our society. We can see the transformation of monetary system, media, governance, and many others, education, and many other sectors. So it seems like the whole society is being drawn into a kind of whirlpool of transformation. And when COVID came, it felt on one hand that as if our global civilization has sort of stopped in its tracks. There was a disruption in international travel, in global logistics. A lot of people were concerned that international trade might stop and so on. But what happened actually is that it also became a factor that significantly began to transform the working reality and the economic reality. And industries around the globe began to adapt to this reality. So in the study that I mentioned, we look at 7 aggregate sectors that cover over 90% of global economy. And we saw that actually all of them experienced significant impact because of COVID. And 4 main factors were identified. Of course, everything that we experienced in the last 2 years around hygiene and biosecurity rules was very evident, but also the rise of remote work, which continues to be spread as a new way of working in many sectors. And in parallel to our study, McKinsey Global Institute predicted that throughout this decade, up to 30% of all jobs will move to the remote modality of work. And in addition to that, there was a significant rebuilding of national economies, and through increase of, let's say, demand for more efficient businesses, some of the older jobs began to disappear, and demand for new jobs that are more technologically enhanced, more productive, began to increase. And perhaps the process that we witnessed with COVID is not, let's say, the last disruption. And right now, another one is happening in the European part of the world. The military conflict between Russia and Ukraine produces, let's say, shock waves around the global economy, affecting in global energy crisis and global food crisis. And this probably will begin significant rebuilding of the world economy in the next year and afterwards. So this actually challenges many of the ways in which our society operated throughout the previous decades. And we can see that we're entering sort of a perfect storm where different types of crisis, economic, political, geopolitical, refugee crisis, and so on, are beginning to, let's say, influence each other and require that we seek new models of global security, new models of economic organization. So this disruption actually highlights that we're living in the world that is increasingly uncertain, increasingly ambiguous, but also increasingly complex. And some even started to use in the last 2 years the abbreviation BANI, which means brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. So to highlight how the world is becoming increasingly fragile and increasingly hard to understand. But still, there are, let's say, the megatrends, the forces that are shaping our civilization and its evolution are very present. And to use another metaphor, we can imagine we are in the storm, but if the storm happens in the ocean, underneath the surface of an ocean, there are these big currents that are driving the movements of water. So even if there is turbulence, even there are waves, and waves can be high for ships sailing, they're still, let's say, relatively small in comparison to the depth of the ocean itself and the big water masses that are moving. So megatrends are something like this. There are major shifts that are happening in our civilization, including demographic changes, technological changes, urbanization, that will continue despite the turbulences that we are experiencing. And perhaps one of the strongest transformation that will continue to occur is technological transformation. There are, let's say, many players around the world that are promoting and supporting this type of transformation, the use of artificial intelligence, robotics, and augmented reality, new models of productions to increase productivity and competitiveness of local economies and global supply chains. And if we look at the let's say types of technologies that are entering markets right now and become proliferated, there is a very good, let's say, type of research that looks into these emerging technologies, which is called Gartner Hype Cycle. You can see that actually technologies that are entering our market and our working practices are all related to most of them are related to artificial intelligence. So these technologies, from being, let's say, something that is more like a hype, just some kind of anticipated future possibility, they become part of the new normal for working realities. And this type of discussion you probably have heard many times before. The research that has been done by colleagues from Oxford Martin School of the Future, who looked at the issues of future of work and anticipated jobs that have the risk or challenge of being automated. And their estimation is that up to half of all jobs in the world are technically becoming obsolete in the next decade. Well, technically obsolete doesn't mean that they will be immediately replaced by technologies, but it means that these jobs are not, let's say, guaranteed careers anymore. And over time, with different speed, depending on policies in different regions, these jobs will go away. But does it mean that human beings will not find new occupations? Of course not. And if we look historically at how such transformation occurred in the past, we may recognize that every wave of automation before actually created more jobs than it destroyed. So it was, in the end, beneficial for the economy. Of course, this previous transformation didn't occur as fast as this one is happening, because this is, let's say, the fastest in history. Previously, they could occur, let's say, as generational shifts. So one generation would stay, for example, in rural area, and the new generation would move to cities and take on the industrial jobs in cities. Nowadays, everybody is affected, but the way that is happening is that humans are moving from standardized and routine and robot-like jobs, but there are many new opportunities in the economy that are related to, let's say, human-to-human relations, creative type of activities, and more customized and unique contributions to economy. And one of the things that we saw in our studies consistently is that a sort of human-centered economy is emerging, where, let's say, businesses are moving away from consumption-based, more alienated type of research interaction with consumers, to a more participation-based, community-based. And therefore, relationship building becomes increasingly important, as well as creativity. And we can see that many businesses are beginning to create their own communities. They increasingly engage and build up relationship with their customers. And let's say, people are increasingly interested not just in consumption, but in human experience. So this is just like, let's say, an early manifestation of some transformation that is going to happen throughout the next decade and afterwards. And as I have mentioned, this movement to more, let's say, unique and relation-based type of production also means that competences need to become, and combination of competences for professionals need to become, let's say, more unique. There has to be a focus increasingly not on standardized skills development, but on development on human uniqueness and human talent. And the idea that we don't need to talk anymore about human resources, but we need to talk about talent, and every human being as someone whose talent needs to be nourished, is the paradigm that is quickly spreading in the professional development. And actually, our study together with Boston Consulting Group a few years ago indicates that it might become one of the drivers of global economic growth throughout this decade. Of course, we should not only talk about the challenges related to technological transformation and related social transformation. We should also recognize that one of the biggest challenges in the coming decade and afterwards is the remaining non-sustainability of global economy. And one of the things that probably you have experienced firsthand is continuing heat waves that happen around Asia, including Malaysia, India, and other regions in 2022. But this is just an indication of a risk that we are facing around the climate change and, let's say, destruction of natural environments. And some people, some researchers prefer to look at it as a comprehensive process that actually happens across many scales. So one of the studies that I strongly recommend is called Planetary Boundaries, which looks at the 9 fundamental boundaries or dimensions that establish human well-being on the planet. Including the let's say the non-degradation of soils, the availability of soils, diversity of biosphere, the level of acidification of oceans, composition of atmosphere, climate, and so on. So all these dimensions actually highlight, if we look at the dynamics that is happening, that humanity is sort of surpassing the threshold of parameters where it is able to cope with change. So this is a huge risk. And therefore, I think we should not only talk about the action for climate change, which has been promoted in the last decade, we should talk about a more comprehensive transformation. And what that transformation means, it means that we need to find ways for our economies to become genuinely sustainable, or as some say, circular and regenerative, which means that we need to move away from using finite resources and polluting the world around us, but we need to find ways to sort of say circulate every finite resource, use it back in our economy, reduce the waste, and can gradually move to technologies that, let's say, are nature inspired, that are nature driven, that are friendly to natural processes, including chemical products that are friendly to biosphere, including use of, let's say, methods that increase, for example, biodiversity while maintaining agricultural production or maintaining our energy production systems. And there are already many technologies present that have been developed to, let's say, serve this mission. But the next decade and afterwards, we'll see them really spread in the economy and become part of the normal work of our economies around the globe. So to summarize, what we see as emerging is a rise of, let's say, factors that are quickly transforming all economic sectors around the globe, primarily around these two dimensions, the dimension of technological change and the fourth industrial revolution, and the dimension of, let's say, ecological technologies that become to proliferate in literally all sectors. And one model that I really enjoy using is called Three Horizons. It is a model that describes how the change is happening in our societies, that talks about, let's say, the waves of change. So one wave is the dominant paradigm or the dominant approach. It is Horizon 1. It's something that is already happening, but slowly or fast, in a fast way, goes away. The next paradigm is something that is emerging right now in response to some problems of the old paradigm. And usually this is not a complete solution. The complete solution is something that begins to emerge gradually. It's called Horizon 3. And that deals with fundamental contradictions of the existing paradigm. So if we apply it to the modes of production, and if we apply it to ways of organizing our industries, we can see that the old industrial paradigm is sort of going away. And COVID indeed accelerated the transformation, and we can see how, let's say, new digital network-based modes of production and organization of economy have started to take root. But they don't really allow for, let's say, a solution of some of the massive challenges, including the problem of sustainability. So the regenerative paradigm, let's say, is that third wave that will accompany the digital change. And the combination of these two, let's say, will be the manifestation of the new way of working that will spread throughout the decade and afterwards.
Pavel, can I ask you a question here?
Yes, please, please.
Can you go back to the previous slide? Because, well, and I also encourage also the participants to ask questions if they are, because I mean, what you are presenting is, of course, very, very insightful and very interesting. I had a feeling, but I would like to have your take on my feelings, that it's clear, as you put in these slides, that COVID has actually accelerated the Horizon 2. So the digitalization, of course, of the economy, etc., with all the skills consequences. But at the same time, or at least this was my feeling, somehow it is slowing down the regenerative Horizon 3. So I see because of several reasons, COVID, but also existing conflicts, somehow going back to carbon fossil, for health and safety reasons, we have started to use single-use plastic devices that were abandoned some years ago. It's clear that COVID has accelerated Horizon 2. I would like to ask you how do you feel that COVID has played in terms of the emergence of Horizon 3? Of course, in any case, it will be slower than the second. So we see the red curve ramping up at a slower pace than the blue one. And this is, I think, under the eyes of everybody. But I would like to hear from you if actually you don't think also that somehow COVID is even, let's say, not only decelerating, but somehow also hindering the green curve to ramp up.
Well, thank you, Stefano. I think this is a great question that actually concerns a lot of people related to environmental movement around the world, and of course the challenges related to the present war and the implications of energy crisis and the implication of food crisis also sort of push back or pull back the use of more traditional, let's say, methods of production. So it seems as if, let's say, these recent processes, instead of accelerating the transformation, they sort of suppress it around this Horizon 3. But because actually let's say that wave of transformation is something that currently only emerges, I think we are dealing with a more complicated process. And let's say there are several aspects that are playing out. And one of them is that actually the impact of COVID on, let's say, national policies has played into two types of factors that I also mentioned. One is something that the idea to prioritize, let's say, different forms of well-being of population. So we can see even with COVID that not only economic considerations played into, let's say, the decision making. So economies actually were stopped to support the human well-being in terms of health dimension. And actually, if we think how to establish the regenerative approach in the world, what is required is a shift towards, let's say, more prioritization, more focus on that dimension of universal well-being. And that's one thing that I feel is important, and that's going to spread. So kind of remembering that we humans need to take more care about humans, and learning to take care of ourselves. We also learn to take care of nature. So I don't think, first of all, that this factor only played negatively. The other factor that I think is quite relevant is the rise of, let's say, need for more national level and local level resilience of economies that also requires, let's say, the use of technologies that will, let's say, make these economies locally resilient. And so, for example, if we talk about the regenerative paradigm, it is essentially about creating more local autonomy instead of using, let's say, large-scale supply chain, using less transportation, using less global supply chain, more relying on local products and methods of production, more use of more traditional methods of production that actually play towards the sustainable modes of production. So I think that, let's say, the impact of COVID on this third horizon is sort of, say, controversial. It's not, let's say, one way, but it's not certainly not only negative. So there are, let's say, also positive forces that are building up. And one more thing that I feel is needed to say is that, let's say, the fundamental drivers of this horizon are very present, and they become increasingly evident.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good point. I like this idea of the humanization of policies. I think this is very true. And yeah, okay, thank you.
All right. So thank you very much for your question, Stefano. Yes, I encourage participants also to ask questions. So if you have a question, please use this button of raise the hand and go ahead and ask questions if you have any. So let me continue. And that's, let's say, the last part of the results that I wanted to share with you in terms of the findings of the study that I'm describing. So what we found out is that impact of different factors, including the ones that I described, but of course there is, let's say, a more comprehensive picture that we need to look at around the major sectors of global economy. Produce a demand for, let's say, a new type of what we can call a fundamental skill set. So the fundamental skill set is something that is a type of skills that will be required, will make workers competitive in any economic sectors, despite, let's say, the specifics of that sector. So this fundamental skill set comprises of four, let's say, spheres or sectors, and obviously one of these four sectors is related to the technological transformation and increased use of digital skills that are becoming ubiquitous in this decade, including understanding of robotic technologies, AI, and different other types of technologies. But as I have mentioned, this doesn't imply that we only need to learn these digital skills. Instead, what it means is that the more automated, the more technologically intense is our economy, the more we need to learn how to relate to other humans and organize our human, let's say, work, our collaboration, our collective processes. So the sector of socioeconomic and socio-cultural skills becomes increasingly important, including skills of collaboration, co-creative collective work, entrepreneurial work, and different types of, let's say, let's call them human and emotional skills related to our ability to relate with one another, to become compassionate to one another, and so on. This also becomes an essential part of our economic activities. Third type of skills is related to cognitive and what we can call also foundational skills. They describe how we adapt and thrive in the complex social reality, and our ability to learn, our ability to adapt to changes, coping with uncertainty, but also understanding what drives the future changes, and different modes of thinking, different types of thinking, including critical thinking and creative thinking and system thinking, are all becoming increasingly important for professionals to survive, not only adapt, but also thrive in this changing social reality. And as I have mentioned, the last sector is called universal well-being, and it's related to our ability to take care of ourselves, our partners, our team members, our organizations, region, nation, and the whole world. And related to that are also different green practices that allow us to take care of nature and understand how we can care not only for human beings, but for planet as a whole. And of course, this demands massive changes in professional education, and I will not go into too many details here, but I would like to highlight that, of course, all of this requires significant changes in curriculum, pedagogical approaches, models of assessment that allow us to assess these new types of skills, and change of frameworks that are used by professional education sector. And also, it is very clear that because of these fundamental changes, we do not only need to cultivate skills as such, but we also need to cultivate mindsets. We need to change, let's say, our the ways that we approach the social reality, so that let's say next generation of workers become increasingly flexible, open to change, creative, and entrepreneurial. And if you look at the study that I'm now describing, it also gives this more, let's say, granulated, more detailed view of what is happening in specific sectors around of the global economy. So what are the factors that drive change? What are the skills that are demanded? And actually, these maps represent results of what we call skills technology foresight. So although I described the fundamental drivers, they actually were all derived from sectoral work that we did in this study. And you can take a look later at this work. I will send some links, including the links to this presentation, because we've been looking into these changes for the last decade, and we published a number of reports that highlight and describe these changes. But going further, I would like to shift now to the topic of skills technology foresight. And first of all, I want to ask ourselves, given everything that we have just discussed, what are the needs? Like, can we use any foresight technologies, methods in this increasingly uncertain social reality? And yes, we can use them, because many drivers of change are those fundamental changes. And indeed, let's say, despite, let's say, national and sectoral differences, many drivers of change are very common. And I mentioned some of them, technological and environmental related, but there are also social factors that are driving this change. And of course, the transformation creates a massive skill gap, which produces a significant, let's say, shortage of productivity of the or deficit of productivity of the global economy. And if we expect that job markets and professional education system will adapt to these changes, responding, so to reacting, of course, that is increasingly hard, because speed of change is increasing as well. So actually, to be competitive, nations need to not just respond to the future trends, but anticipate them and prepare for them in advance, or maybe sometimes even catalyze the change, being more proactive, institutionalizing new forms of education, new policies for job markets in preventive, not let's say reactive way. And why also we need foresight as a methodology and look at sectoral specifics is because even though, let's say, many drivers of change are very universal, there are also many drivers of change that are very sector and nation specific. And so we need an analysis that looks deeper into these specifics. And I will describe this method now, and I will not give, let's say, every detail, because some of them may become too technical for you. So I encourage you later to look in the guidebooks that we wrote if you want to know more and see how you want to apply these methods in your own work. But let's say all the critical elements of it I will describe now. So first of all, a very brief history. So we created this methodology of skills foresight about 10 years ago. It has been applied in live sessions when people come, let's say, to the same room and share it. That was the case about a few years ago. Now we're more used to this online ways of working. And throughout the last decade, we applied it in over 20 countries around the world. And also we started using online foresight methods. And I will briefly describe how you can use this methodology online. And the research that I presented was conducted online. So we actually, it seems that in methodologies like this, we can leverage the power of online to bring experts from all over the world. And that allowed us actually to bring people from over 50 countries in the studies that we conducted. So how do we look at the issue of socioeconomic transformation and transformation of skills? So trends, as those that I have described earlier, are factors that are driving change in the workplace. And when we look at the changes, we look at, let's say, two types of factors. So one are these fundamental trends that are continuing processes, such as, for example, the proliferation of automated technologies. And we can also look at some additional drivers, like these different types of economic shocks. Like we looked, for example, at the implications of COVID and how it disrupts the nature of work. But still, the disruption was based on the fundamental trends that were happening in the previous decades. And COVID actually, it did not, let's say, radically transform those trends. It actually accelerated the proliferation of trends that were already there. So because of the changing workplace, we can see that tasks of workers are also changing. And what it means that some tasks you can do within the existing job with some modification of the skill. So for example, a surgeon that begins to use a robotic device to operate with more precision is still a surgeon and still uses the same motor skills, but let's say begins to use a new tool. So the job ultimately of the surgeon is not changing, but there are, let's say, some modifications. So it is something that we can call a transforming skill. Sometimes when the technology arises, we can see the proliferation of a new and emerging skill. So for example, in the last decade, there was a very quick spread of blockchain technologies or the use of social media in marketing. And this gave rise to new professions that became increasingly demanded by companies. And some skills will obviously go away. So maybe some non-automated types of work and so on, they become obsolete. So we need to recognize that technological change, not only technological, but social and cultural, can have these three types of impacts on skills. And in our method, we look at all three, let's say, types of impact: the emergence, the transformation of skills, and the removal, because of becoming obsolete. Also, something that you need to recognize is that there is, let's say, a mutual, what we can call causal link between technologies and skills in every sector. So on one hand, when we look at technologies, they become an enabler and they demand new skills. So for example, if mobile devices or augmented reality are spread in, for example, creative sector and begin to change the nature of work in that sector, this is where technologies are demanding the change of skill in the sector. But in its turn, when skill is already there, it enables the use of technologies and further development and proliferation of new technologies. So there is, like, let's say, a mutual causal link where technological development drives human development and human development drives technological development. In the nutshell, I will look more attentively into this methodology in a few moments. But in the nutshell, the skills technology foresight actually looks into these questions as a series of, let's say, questions that we ask to participants of foresight sessions. So what we begin with mapping of trends, processes that shape the transformation of a sector. We recognize that these trends create, let's say, demand for different types of technologies, not only, let's say, hard technologies, which are, let's say, materials and equipment, but also soft technologies, such as new ways of organizing and new ways of management. So this produces the demand for new work tasks and changes in workplaces. And once we can identify the new work task, we can ask whether the existing skill composition allows to fulfill these tasks, allows to let's say, respond to them. So this sort of allows us to move into discussion around the skills demand. So we can see which skills will be demanded, which skills will become obsolete, and so on. Then we can do some analysis of the gap between what is there in the market already, what we are able to provide, and what, for example, we don't have throughout different forms, including professional education, which allows us to speak about the implications, what kind of projects need to be initiated in terms of policies, in terms of changes in job market organization, but also in terms of professional education to supply for these new and emerging skills or transforming skills. So looking at the sectoral, the choice of sectors, so to say, which sectors are more, let's say, interesting when we consider them. So first of all, it's interesting to consider sectors that play significant role in the national employment and national, let's say, have the potential for increasing national competitiveness. For example, it could be electronic equipment in case of Malaysia. Also in sectors that have significant impact on economic growth and where technological transformation really shapes the operation mode. And so the technologies indeed are one of the drivers of the change in that sector. When we begin looking at that sector and we begin the foresight process, one thing that I would like to highlight, that foresight itself is not just a study. It's not only about anticipating a skill and recommending some policy changes. Actually, when you engage participants of the project of the foresight, it also becomes a point of collaboration, a point of negotiation between different players in the sector. So actually, you can already see it as a space where certain policies begin to be implemented, certain types of consultations begin to occur, negotiations between different employers in the sector, discussions with policymakers, discussions with professional education sector. So actually, foresight already, by the fact that it's being conducted, begins shaping, let's say, processes in the sector. And therefore, it's quite important to have the proper sectoral partner, someone who will be interested in driving the change further. It can be a sectoral skill council, it can be an employers union, it can be a university that works with transformation, it can be one of the ministries, but it has to be someone who has, let's say, leverage on making sure that foresight ideas and foresight findings do not stay in the air, that they become implemented. Then, of course, we need to look into what we already know about the sector. We need to find participants who will join the Foresight sessions. And to give you ideas of who needs to be in the room to conduct a Foresight, we speak about 3 types of experts. Of course, the dominating group in the room needs to be people that understand the sector, so they have to be representatives of leading employers, small and medium enterprises, including startups. And startups are quite important because they are players that disrupt the existing practices and can talk about the new technologies, whereas leading employers are mostly talking about the dominating technologies and approaches. We need companies that work with the sector, for example, suppliers or those who buy from the sector, customers, R&D organizations, and so on. We also need skills development professionals, HR people, representatives of educational sector, colleges, universities, training companies, and so on. And we need also additional experts, including regulators. It's useful to have some strategic consultants and futurists who can give, let's say, more non-biased view and give more, let's say, creativity to the session. And it's sometimes useful to have prospective labor market participants, such as, for example, students of colleges who can talk about their desires for changing jobs, for changing skills, and their interests and what they believe will be the future. So having that group in the same space, it can be a physical space, it can be an online space. We organize the Foresight session. Well, basically, we can have a session with just one group that will work on the trends and we'll discuss what emerges. But usually, since it's a big, let's say, preparation to organize such a Foresight process, it makes sense to have more people in the room, several groups, maybe focusing on different topics of the Foresight, different aspects of the sectoral transformation. So it means that we require multiple groups and a team of facilitators to work with the Foresight. Therefore, we have a person who is a Foresight leader who is responsible for the whole project, and we have a facilitator, someone who works with this methodology, supported probably sometimes by an additional team member who will do the housekeeping, who will do the timekeeping, note-taking, and all kinds of work. And facilitator is the key person who works with participants and takes their ideas and puts them on what we call the map of the future. And that map is quite important in this methodology. So again, as I have mentioned, the Foresight can be described as a series of questions that we gradually explore, looking first of all at trends, key processes that shape the transformation in technological transformation, social transformation in the sector. We look at technologies, we look at opportunities for business that emerge, also risks for existing business practices, what we call threats. And this creates a vision. Then we map out what we look at every, let's say, trend, every technology, every opportunity for businesses. And opportunity, for example, can mean the opportunity to create a new product based on this technology that comes into a sector, or a new market niche. Then we ask what kind of work tasks are changing, what are the new, let's say, realities, what work tasks are disappearing. And then we can, based on that, describe which kind of skills are going away or are emerging in the sector. So normally when we meet face to face, the process will look something like this. There will be a map, which is a visual representation of these trends and processes And I will briefly later talk about the organization, the composition of map. You can see that it has these different lines. The horizontal lines are trends that are shaping the future, whereas the vertical lines denote, let's say, different time frames. So we usually work with near horizon, something that is very evident, that is already happening now, as we can say, the present future. The midterm horizon is something like, let's say, something maybe a few years in advance. It depends on the let's say, rate of change in the sector. Some sectors are more conservative and rate of change is slower. So maybe the midterm horizon is a little bit more far away. This is where, like in the midterm horizon, strategic decisions are being made. So when, for example, new technologies are being introduced, they can change the practices in that sector in the midterm. And long-term horizon is something that happens more into the future. It's a little bit like, let's say, on the boundary of science fiction, as we sometimes say. This is where more futuristic things are happening, and where technologies can be more radical, let's say, more radical expectation for technologies. And to fill in this map, we use cards, such as you can see on the right of the screen, like trend cards and technology cards. And when the group has an idea about some future factor, as they say, so for example, they say, we see that this type of trend is happening in the sector. Okay, let's describe it. And they try to describe it, saying what increases or what decreases, what kind of process is happening. And then we ask, when is it happening? Is it happening already now? Is it emerging? So they try to put that trend or other factors as technologies also in the time scale to see if it's happening already now or will happen in the future. So why I think that visualization is so important? Because normally without visual mapping, when we simply ask participants, okay, can you name the factors that are relevant in terms of technological change, in terms of social change, they primarily focus on, let's say, what is right ahead of their eyes. So what we can call the near term future. Some changes that are very evident. And that doesn't allow us to see how these different factors are interacting with each other. But once we begin visually mapping them and putting all these factors on the map and seeing, okay, this happening earlier, this probably will happen later, we can see, okay, first of all, the causal links between factors. So we can say, for example, this type of transformation in the industry will require this type of policies that need to happen before or after, as, for example, enabling policies or responding policies. And these policies, in their turn, can provoke certain types of economic transformation in the sector. So we can explore the causal links, let's say, between different factors happening in the future. And we also can see how these changes can produce new possibilities, new trends that are not yet evident, but can begin to proliferate in the next, let's say, stage of development. So this visualization is very, very helpful to understand what drives the change and how the change will unfold. Also, in terms of expertise, I have mentioned that we need a very, let's say, diverse group to create a foresight. But essentially, let's say this group is demanded, is required, let's say different expertise is required at different stages. So for example, when we talk about trends, the best people in the room to identify these trends are people who work with strategies, such as strategic planning officers or marketing experts, trend watchers, business consultants, and so on. Once we start talking about hard and soft technologies, it's more about, for example, R&D specialists and people who specifically work with these technologies, including equipment suppliers, technology transfer experts, and so on. When we begin working with a topic of working tasks, we need people who work with humans, like HR officers or already some educational specialists or trade union representatives. And of course, when we talk about skills demand, it's useful to have also education specialists in the room. But still, even though, let's say, different experts are required at different stages, it's very useful to have all of them in the room for this conversation, because by listening to one another, they begin, so to say, to reconcile what are the problems of other part of the, let's say, same sector. Because many of you may know that, let's say, quite often, let's say, business people and people from education, professional education sector, rarely talk to one another, even though they are supposed to say, let's say, fulfill the same purpose. But the interaction between them is lower than we desire. So this kind of process actually allows them to reconcile their perspectives, understand each other's problems, understand what drives the change, and align their goals in working together towards the future of the sector. Also, in terms of looking at horizon, I would like to highlight that actually the technological foresight, when we talk about the technologies, can only forecast changes for a more limited time frame. So it's, let's say, maximum of 10 years, because of course we can see that technological change is very fast, new technologies are emerging. So when we talk about technical skills, they are only, let's say, anticipated for the period up to 10 years and usually less than 10 years. Whereas, let's say, there are other dimensions that are also emerging in the foresight that are relevant, for example, soft skills and new types of social practices and, for example, mindsets and new ways of thinking. They are more fundamental and they have a longer term, let's say, implications for the sector. So even though, let's say, the normal range of forecast for foresight is up to 10 years, you can talk about these longer term implications, and that helps create a more fundamental change in the sector. So once we create these future maps, we start to see the possibilities that are emerging and the demand for new skills that needs to be expected. So what needs to happen next? One of the key things is that you need to share these results. So first of all, by verification sessions, conducting the additional discussions with experts that have not participated in the foresight session, and also creating some kind of outputs. It's very helpful if you have some visually attractive maps, for example, or reports that are very easy to read and fun to read. And I will give you one example in just a minute. And also, it's very helpful to establish sectoral working groups together with a key sectoral partner, groups that will make sure that findings of foresight, because usually there are many findings, many insights, ideas, and propositions that need to be established. It's useful to have these working groups around each initiative, so to make sure that they are not lost, that they are really established in the sector. Maybe last question for this methodology is whether how often it makes sense to conduct it. Well, basically, normally it is every 3 to 5 years, because every 3 to 5 years we have some, let's say, significant changes in the sector that require already some new mapping. But sometimes disruptions happen, like the COVID situation, and we might require, let's say, additional foresight sessions to map those out. If nothing significant happens, there is no need to conduct this exercise once again, because you will not have any massive new findings. So it only makes sense when you see some kind of disruptions. Now, let me quickly talk about the use of this methodology for online. As I have mentioned, COVID actually forced us to start using it online, but we really enjoyed it. And the way you can organize this type of work in online, you can actually, what you need to do is to, in our work, for example, when we did the skill anticipation, we basically broke a session into 2 parts. So the first part was more focused on mapping of the future of the sector and transformation of tasks of workers. and it was more focused on, let's say, the collaboration between and discussions between sectoral experts that, as I have described, people from, let's say, technological practices and strategic practices. And the second part was dedicated to necessary changes in education and training and changes in skills. So going through 4 questions, we used a collaborative document. Let's say there is a multiple types of collaborative software that exists online. The most, let's say, accessible is Google Docs. So you can just simply use Google Docs and simple templates to fill in collectively. You can also use collaborative software such as Miro boards. Many, let's say, approaches that allow you to work online and source the ideas from participants of the discussion. So, as I have mentioned, in our case, we conducted almost 20 sectoral discussions with this study that I have described today. And also, additionally, what we did once we conducted them through the methodology that I described, we have also converted them into surveys. So, for example, we can see that each of these ideas that was expressed, for example, the rise of a new technology, is more like a hypothesis. So you can ask an additional panel of experts online through an online survey to rank how important this particular technology is. So in our case, it allowed us to get not only, let's say, qualitative data, but also some quantitative support for this data. More precise estimations of dates where these factors can play out, and more precise estimations of the importance of these factors. So this is something that I also strongly recommend if you conduct this type of project online. The very last thing I wanted to share with you is something that you may also consider attractive for the application, let's say, of findings of such process. So something that we originally created in the context of Russia, but then it has also been applied in several more countries. So right now there are atlases of jobs in Kazakhstan, in South Africa, and Romania. Romania specifically focusing on green jobs. So what we did when we did these projects in Russia, we conducted sessions with, let's say, multiple economic sectors. So together we looked into almost 30 sectors of economy in a lot of details, and mapped out over 350 new types of jobs in these sectors. And we, after we did it, we conducted, let's say, an additional work with designers to create a very visually appealing project where we have, let's say, cards describing each of these professional occupations. Even created these, let's say, science fiction type of visuals to as if they're looking through the eyes of professional. So you can be very creative and invent your own way, let's say, of conveying this. For example, in one of editions of this atlas, we also created a story about a girl who goes into the future and starts to meet these different professionals and talk with them and understand their occupations. So actually, this kind of product is very helpful for young people, for their families, for schools, for training companies. So it becomes an attraction point for a lot of, let's say, sectoral professionals that help to develop career guidance, help to develop professional training for young people and so on. So this is one of the ways of applying it, which really helps, let's say, spreading the ideas of skills foresight. And last thing, and I'm now concluding, and I think we will have a very short time, but for several questions, is as I have already mentioned, foresight is not only about conducting the study. It's not only about anticipating the future. It actually also helps fulfilling a number of other, let's say, tasks that are required in the society right now. So it helps people participating in the session to understand the future better. So it develops something that UNESCO calls futures literacy. It helps to conduct dialogues between participants in the sector and coordinate between them. And through this coordination, it helps to prioritize actions and understand what needs to be done in the sector. So it also becomes a vehicle, a solution for decision making. Sometimes it's really hard to take the decision because players in the field, stakeholders, do not understand each other. So some of them don't understand each other's needs. So bringing together policymakers, for example, together with business people and together with educational professionals helps to solve many bottlenecks and prioritize decisions that work towards the efficiency of the sector. So this is why foresight is not only, let's say, a method for anticipating the future, but it also becomes a tool for change management in the sector. So I encourage you really quite strongly to practice these sessions because they really help bring the change to the sectors that you work with. And of course, I have only briefly described what can be done because it's more comprehensively described in guidebooks that we have produced, and they are available online on the website of ILO, and you can take a look after the session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel, for the very interesting presentation. I think we both covered the trends in skills, but also at the same time covering the step-by-step approach that has been used and that can be used also in Malaysia to do skills foresight. Now, I would like maybe to give the floor to the participants if they have questions on, let's say, on the method or in general on the skills foresight elements that you have laid out in your presentation. So I shall wait for if there is any question. Nayali, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Mr. Pavel. It is very interesting to see the work involved in doing the skill foresight. My question would be, how can the findings of this skill foresight be integrated into statistical analysis when we do statistics analysis, and if there's any particular country experience that you can also share when how do we integrate, for instance, current skill mismatch into the results of the skill foresight and use this to close the gap, perhaps. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So actually, the method of skills foresight is a qualitative method, which means that we try to identify not, let's say, the quantitative change, but more, let's say, what emerges and what disappears in terms of, let's say, some shifts that are happening. So one of the things that where it becomes useful is actually adjusting the tracking, the statistical methods, because on one hand, statistics is based on, let's say, continuation of time series, the continuation of results year on year. So we can create those time series, we can observe what really changes in the long term. So on one hand, statistics requires that we are consistent. But on the other hand, in our society, we can see that, let's say, we experience more and more rapid change, which means that we need to update let's say, what we measure and how we measure it. And this is exactly where skill foresight is useful, because it actually can highlight that some of the, let's say, things we measure become less relevant, and some important factors are not yet being measured. So I would say it obviously has a lot of implication for changing the national statistical system in job markets, to begin including tracking for, let's say, new types of skills, new types of jobs, and tracking that has, let's say, these the identification of this qualitative change also measured statistically. So as a recommendation, once the Foresight session is conducted, one of the things that you can do as explicitly as one of the projects is a question: how do you update your statistical system, your tracking system, to track the changes that are happening?
Good point. So actually the Foresight actually rings a bell for the statistical offices in order to have always an updated, let's say, picture of what is happening in the labor market. So I think this is actually the point. Do we have other questions? Thank you very much, Layali, for your question. I think it's very relevant coming from the Department of Statistics.
May I have just one short question?
Yeah, please, Mira.
I'm a little bit interested in your past studies. Do we have results that more or less reflect what is really happening now in the present? And thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Pavel.
So is past foresight happened?
Yes.
Are the results of past foresight exercises actually happened? Well, COVID is a
yes, that's
so
it's a kind of reflecting on how the method really worked in the past, what happened, what didn't happen.
Yeah, so if
actually,
you did a foresight 10 years ago, you are already in a position to see if this happened. Yeah.
It's very important actually, and it helps to let's say, to learn to use these methods better. Is looking and reflecting on what types of let's say predictions worked and which types didn't, where we have been more enthusiastic than we should have been, where we have been less enthusiastic. It's really actually very, let's say, funny, because on one hand, frequently when people look at the foresight without, let's say, deeper knowledge of what is happening in the sector, they sometimes continue to see it as some kind of, let's say, oh, it's a science fiction, it doesn't happen. But once they go into the sector, they start to recognize that these change, the majority of changes happen. And actually, what we have discovered that about 70 to 80% of predicted prediction is right. There is always, let's say, a gap, because we are predicting the future, and future is uncertain. So about 20 to 30% of what we predict may not happen, or may happen, let's say, significantly later. Or sometimes, may not happen because, let's say, some anticipated change, like a promised technology, did not come, or did not come as fast. And just to give you an example, in the very last, it's not about our, I can also share about our learnings, but something that was discussed in 1950s very widely was the use of nuclear technologies for home appliances, like vacuum cleaners and cars and so on. So the idea was that we will have, let's say, atomic batteries for everything. In fact, it didn't happen, and we understand now that atomic technology, nuclear technology, turned out to be much more dangerous than it actually is. So home appliances with nuclear technologies never appeared. Something that we anticipated and that didn't happen was the quick proliferation of augmented reality in the last decade, actually, because there were many promising technologies that were quickly developing in early 2010s, but they were not, let's say, commonly spread because people were still uncomfortable 10 years ago with the use, for example, of Google glasses. It became clear that this technology will only be used in professional spaces, and its application would be limited back then. But now we can see, okay, the new solutions are bringing it back, and it's evident that in this decade, the augmented and virtual reality will become part of the, let's say, actively used technologies.
Yeah, we actually had a 3-day experts meeting last week exactly on those topics, which was a little bit of a foresight, I think, as well here in Turin. Okay, thank you very much, Mirela, for your question. Thanks, Layali, for your question. And I would like to thank also Pavel for the great insights. And I also, in this case, we remind all the participants that the webinar is recorded, so you will be able to access it on our e-learning platform. I would like just to announce that Mirela is going to, let's say, give written instructions around the exercises that are coming up in module 3, which will be next module. So I think this is very important. You will receive related, let's say, communications around this so that you can organize the groups for the group work. I would like to once again thank you all for having been with us this morning. It has been a pleasure and I think a very interesting topic also to discuss. Thanks also to Pavel. And we will now meet for the last webinar of the course on the 16th of June for the last webinar. So we will mainly interact with you, with all the participants through the e-learning platform. Once again, thank you very much and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.